So first of all, I'm going to thank Jonathan for the invitation and for organizing this conference and creating this space for conversation and change. And also, so I'm going to, So in my presentation, I'm going to discuss the work of José Fernando Ramírez, focusing on his archival projects related to the study of the history of indigenous peoples in Mexico. I will dedicate the first part of my presentation to briefly introducing the figure of José Fernando Ramírez and his research work on Mexican history and antiquarianism, to focus on the second part of my presentation on the connections. Can you hear well? Okay, good. Good, thank you. It's better, yeah, thank you. To focus on the second part of my presentation, on the connections between Ramírez and the Second Mexican Empire of Archduke Maximilian I of Mexico and his wife Charlotte of Belgium. So what I want to propose with the presentation is an examination of the links between history, politics, and the relations with Native America through an examination of the connections between Ramírez, the Habsburg family of the Second Mexican Empire, and the native cultures and history of Mexico as studied by the cultural elites of Mexico in the mid-19th century. So to begin with a brief biographical introduction, José Fernando Ramírez was a Mexican historian who served as Secretary of State during the Second Empire of Maximilian of Habsburg between 1863 and 1867. In addition to his activities as politician, Ramírez did extensive research work as director of Mexico's National Museum between 1852 and 1865. In 1864, Ramírez made the decision to accept an offer from Ferdinand Maximilian Joseph Maria von Habsburg, Maximilian I of Mexico, to serve the Second Mexican Empire. This decision would mark his life at different levels. In January of 1867, after the collapse of the Second Mexican Empire, Ramírez made the choice to go in exile to Europe, and he never returned to Mexico. In the end, Ramírez's collaboration with the Second Mexican Empire eclipsed his posthumous reputation, which ultimately led to his neglect by future generations of historians. So in the presentation, what I want to interrogate is how Ramírez's connections to the Second Mexican Empire was part of a broader research objective of inscribing the science of Mexico's ancient past in the tradition of classical civilizations as studied during the mid-19th century. So I would like to begin by situating the work done by Ramírez in the first trip he made to Europe in 1855, an important travel that would mark his later projects. On his travel, Ramírez visited museums and libraries in Oxford, London, Berlin, Potsdam, Vienna, Paris, Bologna, and Torino. In his visit to libraries and museums, he met scholars interested like him in deciphering Mexico's ancient past. Among them, Johann Karl Eduard Buschan, the librarian of the Royal Library in Berlin, who had just concluded a study on Aztec place names, a topic of interest to both historians. His encounter with Buschmann was probably one of Ramírez's first meetings with a European scholar in Europe. After this visit, Ramírez met other scholars interested in the study of the history of Native America. He visited Alexander von Humboldt in Berlin, and later in Paris, he had the opportunity to meet with Alexis Aubin, the owner of one of the most valuable collections of Mexican manuscripts, a collection that Aubin was able to take to Paris in 1839 after having spent 10 years in Mexico. This first travel to Europe gave him the opportunity to study codices and manuscripts in European libraries, as the one that we see here in this image, the Historia de las Indias de Nueva España by the Dominican Diego Duran, a codex held in the National Library of Spain in Madrid, which Ramirez could use as reference for the publications of the first volume of the Historia in 1867, which is the last year of the Second Mexican Empire. As we see in this quote included here, colonial codices were for Ramirez artifacts that have the capacity to show Mexican past alive, instead of seeing Duran's narrative as one of the most important colonial codices of the 16th century that directly connects the history of Nahuas to the imperial administration and political power of Philip II. Ramirez saw this codice as part of an archive that would allow him and his generation to emancipate the history of Mexico from external mediations. As we will see, this goal of emancipating the history of Mexico from these external mediations comes in Ramirez's work with the paradox of assuming and reinforcing a genealogy of power that connects the history of Native America to the dynasty of Habsburg. And now we can begin to trace this paradox by looking at Ramirez's research work in Europe. Here, one of the ways to which we can trace Ramirez's approach can be seen in his observations of museum exhibitions and publications. In his first visit to Europe, Ramirez was able to visit several museums, as it said, such as the Louvre Gallery of Mexican and Peruvian Antiquities, which had been inaugurated by Adrien de Montpellier in 1851 from the collections of Maximilien Frank and Latour Allard, acquired in 1832 and 1850. Likewise, he had also access to European publications of the period that had an Orientalist vision of non-European cultures. In his notebooks of his travel to Europe, which you can see in this image and that are today held in the library of the Museum of Anthropology in Mexico, Ramirez enumerates many objects and works within the category of what he called fantastic systems. For example, he questions the illustration in the French edition of William Bullock's Book of Mexico, or the publications of Kingsborough, of whom he tells that he colonized America with Hindus, just as others claim to populate it with the Egyptians and Carthaginians. In his travel to Europe, Ramirez was thus able to identify how the growing interest in antiquities had produced a parallel market of forgeries and reproductions that distorted Mexican history. In these notebooks, he observes that the alterations produced in publications and museums, and he used this experience to organize his own work in the National Museum of Mexico. So, likewise, when referring to the British Museum exhibits in his descripción de algunos objetos del Museo Nacional de Antigüedades de México, a work dedicated to Humboldt that we see here, one of the plates of this work. Ramirez also mentions the great proliferation of violent interpretations, imaginary analogies, and fantastic systems, something to be seen in almost the whole of the writers on American antiquities, act only to recreate the difficulties and make denser the darkness which envelopes that interesting and almost unexplored department of archaeology of the British Museums. So, in contrast to these observations, Ramirez conceived the project of the National Museum in Mexico as an activity that would allow to move away from those fantastic systems that inscribe the history of Mexico into the Orientalism of the period. So here, what we see in Ramirez's observation is that he was particularly sensible to the cultural hierarchies that shaped European publications and museums. Indeed, the European collections of the period were deeply rooted in the increasing capacity of colonial powers to either capture or fabricate artifacts from colonial peripheries and expose them in the expanding galleries of the museums. In contrast to this hierarchical material culture, rooted in the imperialism of the period, Ramirez saw his project in the National Museum of Mexico as one that would move away from that fantastic systems that he could see in his travel to Europe. So here, what I would like to underline the contrast between Ramirez's sensibility and criticism of the European Orientalism of the period and his objective of recovering an ancient past of Mexico that would appear as entirely emancipated from external mediations. It is through this contrast, and I would say also a paradox maybe, that we can understand Ramirez's engagements with the Second Mexican Empire of Maximilian I of Mexico and Charlotte of Belgium, which from its inception was also conceived as a conservative political movement based on the idea of restoring an ancient monarchy associated with the genealogy of power of the House of Habsburg. So now I'm going to move to the second part of the presentation to interrogate the relationship between the Second Mexican Empire, Ramirez, and the native cultures in Mexico. Maximilian I of Mexico and his espouse Charlotte of Belgium, Archduke of Austria, married in Vienna in 1857, where they established their primary house until his departure for Mexico. In 1859, Maximilian briefly met with French Emperor Napoleon III in Paris, where he was approached by conservative Mexican monarchists seeking a European royal to rule Mexico. Initially, Maximilian was not interested, but following his dismissal as the Austrian viceroy of Lombardy and Venetia, the Mexican plan was suddenly seen as an opportunity for him. Since Maximilian was a Habsburg and descendant of Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain in the early period of conquest in Mexico, he was seen as perfect candidate for those conservatives in Mexico who wanted to restore the monarchy. As with Ramirez's objective of recovering an ancient past and lost origin related to the history of Mexico, these conservatives would see in Maximilian a political figure that could be able to reincarnate a new beginning in a context marked by political instability, war, and expansion of liberal ideas in Mexico. And in the short period of government of Maximilian I and Charlotte of Belgium, another important figure that would connect the Habsburgs to the native cultures of Mexico was Faustino Galicia Chimalpopoca. Maximilian appointed him as an advisor to his government. Chimalpopoca also became the personal tutor and interpreter of Nahuatl to Maximilian and was named the president of the Council of the Protection of the Poor. Chimalpopoca found a place among the emperor's inner circle and worked to improve the lives of the marginalized, especially indigenous peoples. In addition to his work as mediator between Maximilian and the native communities of Mexico, Chimalpopoca had an active role as translator and editor for the works published by José Fernando Ramírez. Before the arrival of the Second Mexican Empire, he transcribed or translated Nahuatl documents for over a decade. For instance, he transcribed the Cantares Mexicanos, a work that would become in the late 19th century one of the references for the first attempt to incorporate Nahuatl song into the emerging national literature of Mexico. From this perspective, we can see Chimalpopoca as an indigenous scholar that played different roles as mediator between indigenous communities and those figures of the empire that wanted to use the potential of native cultures to the emerging national and political vision of Mexico. And another important episode defining the relationship of Maximilian I and Charlotte of Belgium was the delegation of the Kickapoo, which took place between January and March of 1565. The Kickapoo people traveled from northern Mexico to Mexico City to meet Emperor Maximilian and discuss territorial matters and seek protection against attacks from different groups and deserting American soldiers raiding in their territory near Rio Grande. By the mid-19th century, the Kickapoo had been displaced from western Missouri amid Civil War conflict, and they divided into three distinct groups in Kansas, Oklahoma, and the group known as the Mexican Kickapoos that traveled through Texas into Mexico to meet with the emperors. The peaceful group was originally from Canada and went to Mexico during the government of Guadalupe Victoria, who granted land in Texas in exchange for guarding the border. After the Battle of Dove Creek in January 1865, in which Texan soldiers under Confederate captains attacked the peaceful Kickapoo, killing 26 members, the Kickapoo went to Mexico to ask for protection and defend their rights over the territory. The conference between the Kickapoos and Maximilian in 1865 created a major sensation in the press in Mexico, and it was documented in several writings and paintings over the years, the most important being that by the French painter Jean-Adolphe Bossuet, and that was also the image that illustrated in the newspaper that we invited in the newspaper about the conference. I think it was this painting. Also, another project connecting the Second Mexican Empire to native cultures in Mexico was his travel to Yucatan. In November 1865, Charlotte traveled to Yucatan along with Ramirez. This trip began with a succession of festivities preceding her arrival in Merida. Charlotte then took the opportunity to visit the ruins of the ancient Maya city of Uxmal. There, she wrote a series of letters and reports that are now in the National Archives of Austria in the Library of Congress. Ramirez arrived at Uxmal before the Imperatrice, Charlotte. As he wrote in his diary, the access to Uxmal was impracticable, and they needed hundreds of employers to clean both the access to the archaeological site as well as the interior of buildings. In contrast to the present, Uxmal was an archaeological site enveloped by dense vegetation. Ramirez, in his diary, recounts the planning of the expedition, detailing the significant workforce employed to clear the area and enable the Imperatrice to traverse the site in her carriage. Here, Ramirez's descriptions of Uxmal relied again on a vision that wanted to bring history alive, which means a history that brings the past without any form of mediation from the present. Unlike other archaeologists of the period, who often decorated their travels with fantastic images that presented these places as unexplored environments discovered by adventurous Western travelers, Ramirez's diary presents a more down-to-earth perspective with references to the embassy of the Imperatrice, Charlotte, and naked descriptions of buildings avoiding any form of mediation. As we see in this quote, Ramirez's approach relied again on the paradox of finding a comfortable place to bring the ancient past without the impure ideas of the present in a moment of war and political crisis. Yet his desire of purity, isolation, and historical recovery was entirely dependent on his position in the interior of a movement of imperial restoration. Here, the final moment of this paradox is that Ramirez's objective of preserving history from the instabilities of politics resulted in the displacement of his archive and work from Mexico. As the Second Mexican Empire collapsed, he found himself exiled in Europe, where he eventually passed away in 1871. So, thank you.